Welcome back to another episode of Life's Ambition Podcast. Today we are joined by someone who has carved their own path in the writing world. She's going to give her input on becoming an author. Without further ado, Adrienne Giordano. So Adrienne, how you doing?
I'm good, Drew. How are you?
Doing pretty good myself. I can't believe I'm talking to one of USA Today's bestsellers. I think that's awesome.
Well, thank you.
But not to get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to know, where did this all start? Kind of like, what was it before the writing scene?
Yeah, well, I think, you meet people in life, they say, oh, I want to write a book, and I've always loved storytelling. I think my dad passed 20 years ago, but he was an amazing storyteller, and he used to sit. I can just remember sitting at the kitchen table with him, listening to these crazy stories he would dream up. And half the time you never knew if the story was true or not.
That makes a good story then.
Oh gosh, always. And then you would always know, because at the end of the story, he would either start laughing, which was your cue that, okay, he just totally made that thing up. But I think just sitting around that table gave me a love of storytelling. And yes, I'm dating myself, but at the time, we had TV, we had movies, like the internet didn't exist when I was a kid. So it was about books and reading, and that's how I filled kind of that well of just loving stories. And then probably when I was in high school, I thought, yeah, I really kind of like this writing thing, because I was the weird person that actually liked my English class. I liked creative writing. So yeah,
Did you ever do the yearbook at all?
I was
Or
never on the
editorial
yearbook.
articles?
No, I never did any of that. I just enjoyed making up little stories in my head, and I would jot them down in journals or whatever. So I think at the time it wasn't really so much that I wanted to become an author. I just knew that I loved storytelling.
And was there ever a scene or a career before the writing aspect itself, before
Oh
you
yeah.
became this wide author?
Yeah, I did not get published until I was probably in my late 30s. So yeah, I went to college. I got out of college. I was a speech communications major in college. And after I got out of school, I went to work at a lobbying firm. They were a lobbying public relations firm, which was really fun. It was very high stress, but I got to write a lot of press releases and things like that. And I knew from that experience that was not the type of writing I wanted to do.
And when it's press releases, are you publishing stuff pretty much? It's like 24 hours, like pretty quick turnover.
Yeah, I can pump out a press release in a half hour if I need to. If I have all my facts, my data, and all that.
And is that where you talk about the high stress?
Yes and no. It was very deadline oriented, but when you're working for a public relations lobbying firm, right? And I was the assistant to the president. So he was in Washington a lot. He was always on the run. So it was a lot of last minute stuff all the time. And that, you get used to it, but yes, it was just a very fast paced environment. So I think that's where the stress came from. And then I went to work for a newspaper, actually, in the advertising department from there. And I worked in newspaper advertising. After I left the newspaper, I went to an ad agency. So I really did not start I'm going to write a book until I was in my probably early 30s.
Dang.
Yeah.
And did you always kind of have, this is what I wanted to do one day? So while you're working for the newspaper company and all these different franchises, that I'm just building the skills to get to that point? Or is it kind of like, I have to fulfill my requirements first, whether it's to my family or husband or whatnot, and so I have to work first, and then maybe I'll pursue my passion later on?
Yes, that is exactly what happened. And I don't know that it was so much thinking about I have to fulfill my responsibilities. I was just busy. I was enjoying my job. I always had that writing bug in me. I mean, at the time I was reading a ton. I would read probably 2 or 3 books a week while working full time. And then, after I became a mom, that slowed down, but I always had that love of books. And I always knew at some point I would probably do something. And then actually when my dad got sick is kind of when it all started, because I was traveling back and forth to the East Coast. I live in Chicago, but my dad would go into the hospital for 2 weeks for treatments, not 2 weeks total, but he'd go into the hospital for a week, and then I would stay for the next week just to help with him. And I had to take a leave of absence from my job. So when I was home for 2 weeks, I had a ton of time on my hands that I didn't quite know what to do with because I wasn't working. So that's really when I sat down and decided I'm going to start a book.
Yeah. And how long did that first book take you?
Well, the first book, gosh, probably 5 years.
Wow.
Well, and my first published book, I should say, took about 5 years. The first book I wrote will never see the light of day. I call that one my practice book because, it's fun when you say, okay, I'm writing a book. And then you sit down and you realize how hard it is to do it. And you realize how much you don't know about writing. So I sort of just figured out, different writing elements, things like that, plot structure, all of that, characterization. And then I put that one aside because I knew it was just that bad. And I started.
Did you ever have someone read it? Did you ever someone read that one?
No, absolutely not. I think I had people read parts of it. No, I take that back. My mother read it. My mother read it because it was about a baseball player, and my mother is a huge baseball fan. So I let her read it, and she loved it. But I was like, this book, I'm telling you, this is a bad book. It will never get published. So my mother did read it, but that was it.
Well, and I'm thinking on the top of my head of things that go into a book. It's a lot of structure based, but there's also a lot of research that will go into it. So like, let's say you're doing a baseball book. Yeah. You have to know a lot of the statistics and basically all the, I would say, background knowledge piece with it as well, because that helps formulate your story. And if you're trying to encapsulate a certain audience, then you also have to build on their knowledge as well.
Yeah, and it really depends on how involved their occupation is with the plot. I've written books that include somebody hacking into something. I don't know anything about hacking, but it was not a major part of the plot. So I was able to do just kind of some top line research. Mm-hmm. Just so people can, in the writing world, they call it suspending your disbelief, right? Just so I could get people to think, okay, yeah, they needed to know was that he hacked into a company. They didn't know actually how he did it. Yeah. So yes, there are little tricks you can do for that.
And what would you say is like the longest part in terms of writing the story itself? Is it the background research? Is it actually even coming up with the idea? And even if so, like, how do you even come up with the idea itself? Because you could have short stories, you could have long form stories that take hundreds of pages. So I don't know, what would you say is probably the hardest process or longest process?
I think honestly, and in talking with authors, it is such a personal, everybody has their own process, right? So for me, in the writing world, they call it being a pantser or a plotter.
Pantser or a plotter.
Right. So and then there are people that are in between. I'm kind of in between. So you're either writing by the seat of your pants, where that is just your creative process, where you're not good at outlining, or your creativity is stifled when you outline. I'm kind of the reverse. I call it my roadmap, right? So I need my beginning, my middle, and my end. And as long as I know where I'm going, I can get through it. I can move through the book fairly quickly. So for me, I think the bulk of the time is spent just figuring out what the story is, because I hate getting to the middle of a book and figuring out, wow, this is actually my starting point, which has happened to me before.
Really? So what do
And
you
after
do then
you've
when that
written
happens?
45,000 words, it's a little painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it takes some serious editing to be like, all right, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna move this over here and I'll just kind of scooch this along.
Yeah. Or sometimes you just have to scrap it.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
How many times have you scrapped something altogether?
Oh my gosh. Maybe twice. Maybe twice. Because
That's good though, all things considered.
yeah. Well, and it's like anything else. You learn as you're writing, right? The more you practice, like, playing the piano or whatever, the more you practice, the better you get at it. So I typically will now know by the time I get, like, for me, a typical book is 95,000 words, between 90 and 95,000.
Yeah.
So by the time I get to about 15,000 words, I can usually feel something is not clicking. Yeah.
And 95,000 words, I know you keep bringing up a word count. Is that just how writer or authors think about how long their book they want it to be, or?
Yes and no, because it depends on, a lot of publishers have specific word counts that they try to hit. That's kind of where my books land at 95,000, is because I started in the traditional publishing world. And
Gotcha.
for the genre I was writing in, they wanted something between 90 and 95,000 words. Because back in the day, if you wrote, like, the first book, the practice book I told you about, was, I think, 135,000 words, which nobody would have published that, just because it was a rambling mess that the plot was all over the place. So back in the day, when publishers asked for a 90 or 95,000 word book, if you could bring the book in at 90 or 95, it was an indication that, yes, you knew how to control your plot.
Okay, because that was going to be my subsequent question is why do they even create this range and of 90 to 95,000? Because I just figured if you have a good plot and it goes to 120,000 words, then I feel like you kind of just let it ride.
Yes, and there are books out there that are, there are books that are fantastic that have gone on to be bestsellers that are that long. It really all depends on the project.
Huh.
Yeah.
I find that pretty cool, all things considered. And when you talk about a lot of the work with the publishers and hitting a word count, is there anything else that goes on with them in terms of this is how you're going to market the book, this is how we're going to operate within it, this is how we're going to review it? And what does that process entail with the publisher itself?
Yeah, well, and the industry has changed so much since I started. When I started, the only way to get a book published was to do it through a publisher. Now, with the explosion of indie publishing, it's a great time to be a writer, because all of the kind of gatekeepers, I guess, the gates have sort of opened now, because back in the day when I started, there was a querying process. And this process still exists today, where you write the book and you put together what they call a query letter. And a query letter is basically a letter that you send to editors or agents, depending if you going directly to a publisher. Most of the big publishers require you to have an agent submit.
Really?
Yeah. So, and you'll hear a lot of writers will say sometimes finding the agent is harder than actually getting, a publisher. So yes, you write it's called a query letter, and it's basically a few paragraphs telling them what the book is about. And some of them will ask, it's different for everybody. Some will ask for just a query letter because they want to see if you can summarize your book in a few paragraphs in one page. Some will ask for a query letter, a synopsis, and 3 chapters. Some will ask you for a query letter and the first manuscript page because they want to see if you can hook a reader in one page. So it really depends. Everybody has their own submission guidelines.
And when you're working with the publisher itself, does it cost a fee each time to send a query letter and all these different kind of aspects with it?
No, it actually should not cost a fee at all. Like, that is one of the big warning signs that something is, I don't want to say amiss, because there are publishing houses out there that you pay a fee and they do all the work to publish your book. But if you're talking about one of the big New York publishers or, one of the larger publishers, there's never a fee.
Really?
Yeah.
And I find that actually very nice then overall, because you could pay subscriptions everywhere. Like, I mean, heck, you pay subscriptions just to listen to audiobooks at this point.
Yeah.
So I find that pretty cool to see that you don't have to pay anything for publishing. And you bring up how indie publishing has really helped kind of accelerate, like, it's different from old times. Now a lot more people are able to publish. Can you kind of go into what that is itself? Like, I have not heard of that kind of publishing.
Yeah, sure. So it's independent publishing. And basically I'm going to say it was 2013, 2014, Amazon came out with what they call Kindle Direct Publishing. And what that means is someone who has a book that they want to publish, but maybe either the book, and here's the thing with publishing that is, it's not for the weak of heart. Let's put it that way, right? You have to be able to deal with rejection over and over and over again. So you can have books that are just fantastic, and the editors will tell you this is a fantastic book and I love it, but we have to pass. Maybe it's a mix of genres and they just don't think they can sell it. It all comes down to the marketing piece, right? Can they market this book in a way that will allow them to make money? And I've lost a couple of really good opportunities because I couldn't get it past, the book could not get past the marketing department. So
you just go somewhere else then?
Oh yeah, you can absolutely go somewhere else. As long as you're not under contract with this publisher. Yeah, you can, you just take the book somewhere else. And that's the other thing, is it really only takes one person to say yes, right? So that's the thing that sort of has to keep you going in the process is, at some point I stopped looking at them as rejections, and I would say they chose to resist, right? Mm-hmm. Because, I would be devastated in the beginning when the rejections would come in, and then it got to be the norm. So I was like, okay, moving on. She said no, moving on, next person. And that's really what it comes down to. Now, that's not to say you're not going to send a query to somebody and on the first try, you're going to get a fantastic publishing deal. It's just so subjective. You just really never know. So what happens with indie publishing is a lot of authors who had these manuscripts that were quite good, but they could not, for whatever reason, get them published through a traditional publisher. This Kindle Direct Publishing allowed them to upload the books to Amazon themselves. So now, and I do both. I do traditional publishing and I do indie publishing now. Because again, I've written some books that the feedback on them was fantastic, and those books have gone on to sell for me really well. But for whatever reason, a publisher just chose to resist. So I basically created my own little publishing company, and I published the books myself.
Now, because you work with different publishing units, I don't know if you're allowed to describe this at all, but are you allowed to say if you guys have a 50-50 kind of split on if a book sells, they get a portion of it, you get a portion of it, or is it all
Yes.
based in contract deals?
Yeah. Well, it's both. It's different for all the publishers. They all have different percentages. It could be anywhere for a print book. It could be anywhere from 8% to 15% goes to the author. For digital books, it's kind of all over the board. Sometimes it's 40%, sometimes it's 50%. It really depends on the publisher. Yeah.
And I wanted to dive a little bit into the electronic realm because now you have different things where you can hear books on Spotify, Audible, Apple Podcasts, like all these different platforms. Has that helped grown your name and your brand, even like your alter ego that you have in the new space, in these new spaces?
Yes, absolutely. Because, we're living in a world of algorithms, right? So if an algorithm on Amazon just decides, oh, yes, this book looks like it's going to do really well, the algorithm helps you. So yes, absolutely. Digital publishing made a huge difference for me. Plus, it's much faster with a digital book than it is the process itself. You can get a digital book to market super quick, whereas a print book through a traditional publisher, like I would turn in a book when I work with a publisher, I would turn the book in and it wouldn't get published for 8 months.
8 months?
Yeah. And that 8 months isn't bad. Sometimes it's a year.
Dang.
Yeah. Because it depends on they call them slots. It depends on where they've slotted you for publication. So there's a lot that goes into that. Plus, they're publishing how many hundreds, thousands of books, who knows, depending on the size of the publisher.
Yeah.
So with this digital world, if I'm doing it myself, I can get the book written and then get it fully edited in a couple of months and get it up on Amazon.
And are you finding that these publishers or even algorithms play more to one style over the other? Like you specialize in the mystery, romantic, suspense books. Like, do you find that the algorithm for Amazon and all these other platforms be like, a lot of people very much like reading romantic books. Let's just keep pushing those out.
Yeah. And I mean, there are definitely genres that sort of carry the load, I guess, for in publishing that most people gravitate to. But I don't know, like at certain times, certain genres are hot and certain genres aren't. So it's very cyclical. But I think with the algorithms, I think the algorithms just take note if a book is selling really well. And if the algorithm sees that the book is selling really well, it's going to give you more and more marketing. And you'll know this because you'll get emails from Amazon saying, oh, look at this book, and that's all because they've identified that this book is moving pretty well up their charts. So let's help it along.
Well, and to kind of bring it all together is, so if Amazon is pushing these books that are getting bought more and more, how did you start marketing your own books? because when you start, it's probably very hard to get your foot in the door, to get all the marketing going, and then start to be like, oh, now all these different websites and even the, I guess, libraries are pushing out this book and advertising it for you. Like, how'd you kind of advertise yourself to become a very well-renowned author?
Yeah, well, it really, first of all, I had a publisher. My debut publisher gave me phenomenal marketing with my first series. So that helped tremendously because it helped me to build a following. But it is, I mean, unless you're one of the lucky ones where your book sells, 1 million copies in a month, it's a very slow build, right? It's something that sometimes takes years to do, and it's starting a newsletter and sending a newsletter out every month or every couple of weeks, and your subscribers just start to tick up. So yeah, it's really just an ongoing process. It's running ads when you have a book release. It's running ads on Amazon, there's a service out there called BookBub that features books. It's running BookBub ads. It's, it's your typical, I think that's where my advertising background helped me because I knew what to do.
Yeah. And especially because I was looking through your website and I saw the newsletter comment, or like the section piece for it. And I was like, oh, like that's a really good way to advertise what else you have going on, or even just having a website of your own so people can kind of relate to you.
Yes.
I think helps out a lot.
Yeah, for sure. That was the website even before I was published. Somebody, I don't know where along the way, had said, make sure you have a website, even if it's just a basic website. They said, because editors and agents, when they get your query, they're going to go and look to see if you have a website, to see if you've already started building yourself a platform, right? Yeah. Because if you have a platform, it's easier to sell your books, right? So the website was one of the first things I did. The newsletter did not happen until once my first book got published, and then I started the newsletter.
Gotcha. And were you the designer of your most recent website?
No,
Adrienne?
I have a designer called 11 Fingers. They're a design group out of Atlanta. And they're actually I think this is my third website. Because, you freshen them up. It's sort of like decorating your house. You freshen it up every couple of years. So I started working with them a few years ago, and they are just phenomenal. Yeah, very talented.
Well, it's awesome to kind of see like how you started building your own websites at first, and then now have gotten to the point where you can have other people start doing it for you, start delegating responsibility so you can focus on your own craft and build your own creativity. Because I mean, building 40 books on your own, 40 plus books on your own is not an easy thing to do, especially when you have writer's block. Can you describe a little bit about how you've kind of gone through that aspect of keep having fresh new ideas, how to differentiate yourself from others?
Yeah. And a lot of it, like, as you say, is about you get to a point where the workload, the administrative parts of being an author. Like, this is what's funny about when people don't really know what an author does, especially if it's an indie published author. We spend most of our time on marketing and admin, right? So our writing time is very precious because we're literally running small businesses. So, and that's the thing, when I tell people I'm an author, they think I'm just sitting around all day, dreaming up plots, which I wish I was, honestly, because that's the thing that I love doing. But the administrative parts, the managing a website, managing, your social media. So I did get to a point where I needed to delegate that stuff because my writing time was dwindling. And as a writer, I know I need a certain amount of energy for my writing. And if I'm strung out because I have a to-do list that's a mile long, that distracts me from the creative side that I need to really protect. So yes, that's why. And, I don't know the first thing about designing a website. Could I figure it out? Sure. But it's not something I enjoy doing. Some authors enjoy doing that stuff, so they do it on their own. They do it themselves, which I think is amazing. For me, it's not something I feel called to do. So, I have somebody help me with the website design. I have somebody that helps me in terms of just managing my newsletter. I write all the newsletters, but she helps me manage the process of keeping up with subscribers and making sure the newsletter is functioning properly, that kind of stuff. So yes, I do have help with the kind of admin tasks of being a writer, so I can protect my writer girl brain. And for me, that looks like I have to write first thing in the morning, because I know that when I start to get tired, I don't write as well. And I can usually 3 to 4 hours is about my max when I'm drafting a book. So I can sit down and write for 3 or 4 hours straight, and then I hit the wall. And then I'll move on to the admin side of, being a writer.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point with the 3 to 4 hours, because before we started the show, we talked about Mel Robbins, and Mel Robbins talked about there's different aspects in your brain where you have the most amount of productivity within 3 hours of waking up.
Yeah,
So within those 3 hours are the most productive hours you'll have throughout a day.
Yeah.
And to me, I've been liking to spend that time where I'll do my big tasks with my job itself, and then boom, those are done and out of the way. So that's been really helpful when I have a fresh brain to be able to do that. But for you, when you talk about the 3 to 4 hours for yourself, is that kind of how you get through writer's block?
Yeah, well, and a lot of times when I'm blocked, and again, this is my personal process and it's different for everybody. So a lot of times being blocked for me means I need to go back to my plot structure. I need to go back to my research. It's because I'm blocked because I don't know where I'm going. So earlier I mentioned how I need the roadmap. So if being blocked for me means I don't know where this story is going, so I need to go back to my outline. I need to do something to figure out what's the next step for me.
Gotcha. Because I find when I am doing a lot of the admin stuff for the podcast itself, that when it comes to reaching out to people, doing a website, doing editing, all that kind of stuff, that I find that I can get tired. So that 3 to 4 hours is really helpful. And like you said, having a roadmap is huge. So like for myself, what I like to do is I like to plan everything I can in advance. So even just with this, have a certain guideline of questions, but realistically just let the conversation kind of take its place. So I'll have a roadmap, but I don't necessarily need to follow it. And like the information that I pull like from your website or like someone's LinkedIn or whatnot, that is super big help in terms of just having an idea. I think that's probably the most useful thing that someone can have.
Yeah, and it's really, for me, it's the same way with writing. Now, there are other writers, I'm amazed, because they don't need an outline. They have an idea and they just roll with it. And I wish I could do that, honestly. But I need to know where I'm going. And once I have that, I can move through it fairly quickly. But a lot of the time for me is spent figuring out the plot.
Gotcha. And I wanted to sidetrack a little bit is how did you find yourself in the mystery romance world of writing?
I loved as a teenager, I loved reading thrillers. But then my sister introduced me to a romance author called Nora Roberts. She's like the queen of romance. She really probably is one of the authors that put romance on the map back in the day. And I just loved her books, but I also loved thrillers. So that kind of led me to finding a genre called romantic suspense, which is literally a mix of basically two people falling in love while they're solving a crime, whatever it is, whether it's a murder, whether it's a kidnapping, whatever. So that's really where I got my start, was with romantic suspense. And then I moved into, mysteries and now women's fiction. So it's, I write in a few different genres.
Yeah, and you have this alter ego, I guess you could say,
yes,
called Anne Dano.
Anne Dano, yes.
How did that come about?
Well, that's a women's fiction book. And because my audience is built on romantic suspense or mystery, in the Anne Dano books, nobody's falling in love and there's not a crime to be solved, right? The book is about, it's called women's fiction. So it's about a woman's journey in her life. So in that particular book, it's about Becca, who is a TV talk show host, she's sort of the Oprah, I guess, of the TV talk show world. She's a clinical psychologist who her specialty is fixing bad marriages, right? So that's on her show. That's what she does. She fixes bad marriages. And some things happen. Her career really is built on this platform of fixing marriages. Well, certain things happen that put her own marriage in crisis. And she really starts to learn things after, 20 years that sort of shock her. And she has to make some really hard decisions about her life. So because it's a different style of book, because it's not a romance and it's nobody's dying in that book, nobody's getting murdered in that book, I should say, I did it under a different pen name because I didn't want my core readers to pick up that book and be disappointed, because it wasn't an Adrienne Giordano book, I guess is the way to put it. It's an Anne Dano book because the subject matter is quite different.
Okay, and do you see, let's say this book, I'm sure it will do really well. Will you put another one in this genre under your name, or would you keep it under Anne Dano?
No, I have another one that I just finished. That's another Anne Dano book. Yeah, they're two completely, in my mind, and a lot of authors don't do the pen name thing. I mean, for 20 years now, I have not done a pen name, but I felt really strongly that I wanted to do the pen name for these books. So yeah, it's almost like a different category to me, right? That's an Adrienne Giordano category, and these are Anne Dano category.
Kind of like your own like superhero name, where you have like
exactly.
Bruce Wayne and then Batman.
Yeah, exactly. And that was fun too, because I got to just recreate myself in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and what book specifically got you to your USA Today like premiere recognition?
Yeah, that was a mystery book called Dog Collar Crime. That's the one that hit the list. Yeah.
And what did that like award entail? Like, how did you know about it? Like, was there a certain amount of sales that went into it? It was like,
yes,
like this is something.
Yeah, and that one, it was kind of fun because it was part of what they call a box set that we had done. I had gotten together with a bunch of authors. An author had reached out to me. It was actually a charity thing. where we were raising money for an author who was sick. So the set hit the USA Today list. And what happens is you have to hit a certain number of sales within a week. And the numbers, it varies every week because it really just depends on how the top book sold. And then, the top book maybe sold 10,000 copies in the week, right? So everything else, that's your number one book. It's sort of like record sales, and then everything below that, to a certain number hits the list. I think for USA Today, it's like 150 books or something. So it's,
awesome.
It's the top 150 books. Yeah.
That is absolutely awesome. Congrats to that. And is there a difference between getting that and then like New York Times bestseller?
The New York Times is like, that's my dream. My dream, my goal in this writing gig is to hit the New York Times list, because that is where the USA Today list is based totally on sales numbers. The New York Times list is based on sales plus I don't know who decides, whether it's their editors or who, but they have input on which books hit the list. So yeah, that for me is sort of my holy grail. Like that's the one I really want. And that's the one I strive for.
Stop book writing now.
Yeah, that's the one I strive for. And I don't know why, but it's just important to me.
I was gonna say, does that mean it's at like the top of like the hierarchy list in terms of like the publishing and all that kind of realm?
I honestly don't know anymore. Back in the day, yes, before indie publishing, yes, it was all about like, are you sitting down because you just hit the New York Times list? Like that's how big it was. It's almost like, I don't know, maybe winning an Academy Award or something. I don't know. But now with indie publishing, I think it just depends on the individual person, like what they want. If they want to be a New York Times, if they need or want to see New York Times bestselling author, a lot of authors don't need it. They're happy making their $1 million a year indie publishing or whatever. So yeah,
I find that intriguing how it's all changed with indie publishing coming out,
yeah,
or like with it out, to how basically all the platforms have changed. You've gone away from the traditional publishing route of working with an agent and then subscribing versus just pushing it out yourself.
Yes. No, it has been fascinating to watch. It sure has.
And to kind of now, can you say that USA Today, like best-selling author across like all your new books from here on out?
Yes. Like now on the Ann Dano books, I can't put that. Like you'll notice if, when you look at Ann Dano, it does not say USA Today best-selling author because Ann Dano has not hit the list, right? Adrienne Giordano has hit the list, but Ann Dano is like, again, it's my alter ego. So until, one of the Ann Dano books hits a list, I can't put that on the book cover.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I, not to totally sidetrack, but did you ever find that you would be a USA Today bestselling author, or did you ever find yourself being like, I'm content with where I am working as a newspaper writer and joining these advertising companies, that wasn't sure if you were ever going to be able to be where you are now?
Yes, because it literally took me, I don't know, it was probably 2 or 3 years at least to get that first book published. I got some fantastic advice from a writer friend of mine when I was querying, because I finished the book and this was the practice book was in a vault. Nobody would see that one. So the second one I wrote, Risking Trust, it was the first book in my Private Protector series. And I wrote that one and I started querying that one. And my girlfriend, who was an editor at a publishing house, said to me, start the next book. Just don't stop writing. Keep writing, because your writing's only going to get better. So just keep writing. So Risking Trust, I was querying. I finished Man Law, started querying that. So I was querying both books at the same time. And then I started the third one. I finished the third one.
Mm.
And then I was writing the fourth one. And then I got a call from the publisher on book 2, because again, I was querying at that point all 3 books. So I got what they say, the call. The call came for book 2. And the editor did not realize it was part of a series. So I said to her, there are 2 other, this is book 2 in the series. I said, there's 2 other books in the series, and I'm now writing book 4 in the series. And she was like, oh my gosh, well, send me everything. So I sent her the first book, and I sent her the third book. And she came back and she said, we're going to make an offer on books 2 and 3, but book 1 needs work. So I was like, okay, how does this work? So she sent me my editorial notes on book 1. And I was working on that while I was doing edits on book 2, because what they decided to do was print the books, publish the books out of order. So book 2 came out first. And I can't remember if books 2 and 3 came out first and then book 1. But they had me write a note in the front of the book saying, this is book 1 in the series. They were published out of order. So in my debut year, I had 5 book releases, because then they bought book 5.
Wow.
Yeah. So I had the tremendous benefit of releasing 5 books in, I want to say it was like 7 months. Yeah.
And when people like really yearn for, let's say it's kind of like Star Wars in my head, where you release the originals before the prequels, and then obviously the sequels come after. So you make the people kind of yearn for the prequel, because if they're reading book 2, they're going to be like, all right, well, what's book 1 all about?
Yep.
And I kind of find how that's kind of what it is with podcasting itself, is one episode can play in some algorithm, whether it's Spotify, Apple, whatever.
Yep.
And it'll pop up for someone and they'll be like, wow, like this is really good. I'm going to go back now and listen to whatever.
To the rest, right.
And if you kind of keep trudging along, then you're hopefully going to stay with that audience. And I'm glad that your friend or writer gave you that advice in terms of just keep going.
Yeah, because again, it's literally like learning. It's like anything, really. Learning to play an instrument, the more you do it, the more you practice, the better you get at it, and the more techniques you learn, and you just improve. And I mean, I go back, and it's funny because, I read some of those early books, and I think, oh, now I would do this instead of that, So sometimes it's kind of fun to go back and just see how much my writing has improved over the years.
Oh, I forgot whose advice I heard this from, but it's always the first time you go through something, it's totally all good. The second time, and you're like, like I wish I made this. And then the third time you're like, all right, I really know how to improve on that aspect.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and pursue that into the next episode, book, whatever you're pursuing on in life.
Yeah.
And so I think that's awesome. And I'm really happy that you got as a best-selling author for USA Today. I think that's incredible. And I just really appreciate you being on the show today.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adrienne. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too, Drew. Thanks.
Hey, everyone. Really appreciate you listening to the show today. If you liked the episode, please give the podcast a like or 5-star rating, depending on what platform you're listening to. Hope to catch you in the next one.